Good morning, everyone. You have just heard from Ming Liang the fascinating story of how he built Razer from a small startup into a global giant. Razer is a great example of what we academic researchers would like to call Gazelles. That is, firms that can scale fast and profitably over a sustained period. In fact, Razer would be what we call a super Gazelles. The obvious questions on the mind of policymakers in every country or region in the world is, how can we have more Gazelles like Ming Liang's? Which in turn begs the question, how good is the support ecosystem of your country or region to help nurture Gazelles? So over the next 10 minutes or so, I'd like to share with you some findings from a research that I've conducted on tech startups in Singapore to hopefully give you some insights to this question in the context of Singapore. Let me start with a big picture view of the Singapore economy, which is this. While Singapore continues to depend on big multinationals and government-linked companies to create jobs and growth, the role of startup has been growing in importance in the economy. As this slide shows, the number of startups in the economy has more than doubled over the last 14, 15 years, and now tech startups constitute about 15% of all startups. Not only that, the number of people employed in young startup companies, firms that are less than 5 years old, have also more than doubled. And you look at the proportion of jobs created as a percentage of total employment in the economy, it has gone up from 7% to over 9%. Now, you may have noticed that it actually peaked at more than 10%, but that was because of the anomaly of the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis, which actually destroyed many jobs in the older firms. So the data show a very clear trend. More and more people will be starting up companies in Singapore, and more people will be employed in startups in Singapore. That seems like a good thing, but it doesn't really tell us very much because we all know that not all startups are the same. And that leads me to the really big idea I want to convey to you, which is that for a startup ecosystem to be truly dynamic, it has to be able to generate great variances in the performance of startup. That is, many of the startups will die. And those that survive, quite a few will just stay alive, but not generate much growth and employment. And these are what we call the zombies. And what we hope is to have enough of what we call Gazelle. Firms like Ming Liang's one that can scale fast and become profitable and create most of the jobs. The challenge, of course, is that we do not know ahead of time which of the startup will be which. And so the job of a good ecosystem is to be very efficiently weeding out the non-performing ones and also limit the number that are the zombies so that more of the resources are quickly channeled to help fuel those that have the potential to become the Gazelle. Some of these fast-growing ones will still die. But the whole thing is that it comes in a package. You cannot say, I have Gazelle and no failures. Right. So if you take this picture, then look at how Singapore ecosystem perform. Now, this picture shows you that actually within 2 years, about 1/4 of all startups in Singapore will die. Within 5 years, about half will disappear. And after 10 years, only about 1/3 will survive. And if you compare how Singapore perform in this regard versus UK and US, you will see that actually the survival rate in Singapore is a bit higher. And towards the end, I'll tell you that maybe that's actually not so good. You can see here that the survival rate is actually higher for tech startup than non-tech startup. Some of you may be surprised to see this. Now, in order to find out more about what happened to the surviving startups, I conducted a study that covered about over 500 startups that we were able to get good answers from. Just a broad overview is that the share of the startup is about 80% in services and 20% in manufacturing, mirroring what we see in the tech sector of Singapore. And no surprise, the majority of them are in ICT, with deep tech sector like biomedical constituting only 4%. The overall demographic, as you can see here, is that close to 3/4 of the startup are actually only up to 5 years old, and less than a quarter of them will actually have revenue of more than $1 million. And the current employment size is such that almost 3/4 have less than 10 employment. So mostly it's very small. And more importantly, if you look at their current financial stage, only about a quarter of them said they have achieved sustaining growth. That means they are profitable. More than a quarter, in fact, had no revenue yet. And about a quarter, close to 30% are revenue positive but not profitable. And so you can see that there is a wide range in the performance of these startups. Now, there are many aspects that we have covered in our study, but I just want to highlight one aspect that may be of interest to you, which is that what proportion of the tech startups are formed by what we call young and fresh graduates. And again, you may be surprised to know that only 1 out of 5 are formed by such young graduates. 4 out of 5 are by more mature PMEs. And you can see here that the PMEs actually form startups that have more deep technology, they have more patents, and they also are able to raise more money. Of course, you see that among the young, fresh graduates, there are more female and more Singaporeans. So I talk about the important role of Gazelle. Now, it's very hard to define really good measures of these Gazelle, but one way to look about it is that who created most of the jobs in the high-tech startup world. And this chart kind of tells you that, in fact, a small percentage of startups, less than 5%, created more than 30% of the employment, and 1 out of 8 of the startups created more than 50% of the employment. So therefore, the ability to create jobs is actually one good indicator of the potential to be a Gazelle. And one way, therefore, I suggest you might want to look at the tech startup landscape is this 2x2 classification, where we have on the top right-hand corner, the Gazelle are those that have employment of at least more than 10 and also have already achieved sustainable growth, that means being profitable. Then we have some other on the left-hand side, which I call them bootstrappers. They are profitable, but they are very small, and they are not growing very fast. Then on the bottom right, we have what we call the growth seekers. These are the ones that try to scale fast, but not profitable, and they hope to be able to become profitable someday, or maybe they can grow fast enough that they may be acquired. And then the majority are actually on the lower left, what I call the struggling ones. These are the ones that are not profitable, and they are not growing fast. And as you can see in this picture here, that more than half of the startups that we have covered are actually in this bottom left corner. And only 8% qualify to be called somewhat like a Gazelle, and I'm already being quite sort of generous in classifying them because my employment kind of size is actually quite small. Yeah? You can see very clear difference in the characteristic between these different categories. As you can see here that the bootstrappers have raised very little external money, whereas the ones that raise the most money are the growth-seeking startup, because they need to raise a lot of money in order to grow fast. And you can see here that the Gazelle and the growth-seeking have generated more revenue, bigger size, and so on. Now, it's a busy chart, but I just want to highlight at the bottom that you may be surprised to know that, for example, the Gazelle in Singapore are actually not that deep tech-based. They have less patent, they are less innovative than those who are trying to struggle to build a product or those that are trying to seek fast growth. This tells you that actually the Singapore ecosystem have not generated that many deep tech-based gazelles, unlike you see in some other places. Okay, I will also just highlight that the growth challenge that different categories face are different. As you can see here, that for the bootstrapping one, it's just a question of finding employees in general. But for the Gazelle, the major challenge is that the market in Singapore is too small for them. They need to see how they can grow rapidly out of Singapore. And for the growth-seeking one, it is a challenge of obtaining follow-on equity funding. Now, quickly, I want to just compare the landscape of the startup as we found in last year in our study compared to a study that we did 6 years ago in 2010. Now, as you can see from this, that actually the good news is that there are more female founders now than 6 years ago. They are younger. There are more first-time entrepreneurs. There are more Singaporeans. And they are more trained in the technical STEM sectors. And if you look at the comparing certain number of key performance, I just want to highlight that we see, for example, there are a lot more of them receiving VC funding, a lot more of them receiving some form of government support, and more of them have a greater amount of intellectual property, and they are also going overseas a bit earlier. So I have just painted a picture with some numbers to help you understand how dynamic is the tech ecosystem in Singapore. And let me sort of conclude by saying that we have become more dynamic over the last 10 years, largely because of improving in the ecosystem support. Remember the figure I showed you about the increasing funding by VC, increasing government support, and increasing number of support by university incubators and so on. But the flip side, what you see in the number I've given you is that we are not producing enough of gazelles yet, and especially not enough of that are deep technology-based ones. Most of those that are currently called gazelle in Singapore are based on primarily IT sectors, not based on deep technology. And if you compare, therefore, Singapore ecosystem, it actually does not perform as well compared to such a dynamic hub as Silicon Valley, Israel, and Shenzhen. And I leave to you to interpret what else we need to do to help promote this. And it may be provocative. Sometimes too much money in the wrong place can generate too many zombies and too many failures, and not enough to support those that need more to actually achieve the potential to become gazelles. Thank you very much.